Hi, and welcome to this live reading from St. Nick's Christmas Wish by Tamara Ferguson, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, Richmond, Virginia. 13-year-old Nicholas Hanover watched in awe as his new buddy Mike whacked the baseball hard, sending it flying deep across the outfield over the fence surrounding the park. Mike grinned, turning back to Nick. Nick shook his head dazedly. "How in the heck?" "I'll show you," Mike murmured, handing over his bat to Nick while stepping behind him and running through the motions. Mike was probably a couple years older than Nick and was a member of the neighborhood junior baseball league, whose team was practicing in the park today. Mike called out to the team's pitcher. "Send Nick a couple of pitches, Manny." "Will do, Mike," Manny answered, winding up. "Ready, kid?" Nick grinned. "Sure." The first few pitches flew by Nick, but he managed to connect hard with the third and sent the baseball flying through the air. "Not bad," Mike murmured, watching the flight of the ball as it landed in the outfield inside of the fence. "Maybe if you get a little more practice in, you might want to join our team." "I'd like that," Nick answered in excitement, "but I'd have to ask my dad first." "All right, you'd still have to try out, but I think the guys want you in. Your size alone will give us an advantage." Mike and the rest of the team had been sitting in the bleachers last week waiting to use the field after Nick's Legion game was finished, when Mike had approached Nick and had asked if he was interested in practicing with them during the week. It was the end of July, and Nick's team had only a few more games left to play. Mike's league began their games in August and continued into fall. Nick was a little taller and broader than most kids his age. In fact, he and Mike were about the same size. Watching as the team began wrapping up practice, Nick asked, "You really think I could be a power hitter?" "I do," Mike answered, "and we're about the same size. We really need another hitter since we lost one of our best players this year when his family moved out of state. I also like the looks of one of the pitchers you used last month. I think his name is Rand McAllister." "He won't be back in town until fall," Nick murmured as he walked with the team toward the parking lot. "He spends time with his father during the summer in Wisconsin." "Maybe he'd be interested in being a backup?" Mike asked. "I could send him an email." "Go ahead and do that," Mike answered. "Want to come with us for pizza?" "Sure. Let me just let my mom know that I won't be home for an hour or two, and she doesn't have to send someone to pick me up," Nick answered, pulling his phone out from his bag. "Manny can drop you off when we're done." "All right." Despite the fact that Mike was 2 years older than Nick, that summer was the beginning of a great friendship. And even though they grew up in completely different circumstances and didn't attend the same schools in Richmond, Virginia, Mike proved to be a great mentor. Nick had been born privileged, his life mapped out by his father, while Mike was part of the Latino community and was being raised by a single mom. That fall, when Rand returned home from Wisconsin, he ended up as a backup pitcher for their team. Rand's true love was football, though, and he eventually hoped to be able to convince his father, who he still didn't spend much time with when he was in Wisconsin, to allow Rand to begin staying home in Virginia for the summer, where he lived year-round with his grandparents. Rand wouldn't be able to play high school football unless he was home to practice with the team at summer's end. "You know," Rand said one day, as they were walking off the field after a satisfying win, "you guys look enough alike to be brothers." Mike blinked and grinned. "Come on." "No, seriously, except for Mike's slightly darker skin and hair," Rand murmured. "Sometimes while I'm pitching and the sun's shining bright, when I turn around and look in the outfield, I have trouble telling you two apart." "That's seriously strange," Nick said, shaking his head. As Mike headed toward the parking lot, an attractive Latina woman stepped out from an older model car. "Mike?" "Hey, Mom, what's happening?" "I managed to get off work a little early today and thought I'd come and watch the game. You guys were great. I was impressed with all your home runs." "Thanks," Mike murmured. "I'd like you to meet a couple of my friends. This is Rand McAllister, and the other guy is Nick, the one I told you about, Nick Hanover." As Mike's mom was reaching out with her hand to shake Nick's, the smile she had on her face suddenly froze. "Hanover? Is your dad by some strange chance named Michael?" Puzzled, Nick shook his head in agreement. "He is. I guess you might know him?" But Mike's mom looked seriously distressed, and her face had gone pale, even beneath her tan, and she hadn't seemed to hear Nick's question. Mrs. Morales seemed to be studying Nick hard, finally acting like she'd come to a huge internal decision when she asked, "You guys have become close, huh?" "We have," Nick answered, "and if it weren't for Mike pointing out the problems with my batting stance and swing, I wouldn't be having the great year I've had." Mike was looking at his mom strangely. "How about going out with us for some burgers, Mom?" Are you sure you want to be seen with me? I think I'm willing to take the chance, Mike snorted, glancing at Nick and Rand. You two don't mind? Of course not, Nick and Rand answered in unison. They were only going for fast food to a place nearby to meet the rest of the team. They usually discussed how well they'd played and talked about ways to improve their game. Mrs. Morales glanced back at her vehicle. I'd offer to take you boys in my car, but I don't have air conditioning. Mike lifted an arm and sniffed. No problem. I'm definitely kind of ripe. We can walk. Mike's mom grinned. Where are you guys off to, the sub shop? Yep, Mike answered. Okay, I'll meet you there, she said, stepping into the driver's seat of her car. Mrs. Morales was super nice, and Nick could understand why Mike didn't have a problem hanging out with his mom. Apparently it had just been the two of them since Mike had been born, and there was never a word said about Mike's father during the next couple years when Nick, Mike, and Rand became close friends. There was something going on with Mrs. Morales, though. Nick could tell by the thoughtful looks she'd been giving him regularly when he was around. Don't your parents ever come to your games? She'd asked Nick once. Nick had shrugged. Nah, Mom is busy with my two younger sisters, and she's not really into sports. My dad travels a lot for work, otherwise he'd probably show up occasionally. Actually, there was a lot more to it than that. Although Mom and Dad lived together in the same house, they barely spent time together unless it was for a social event or a company function related to Dad's work. Sometimes Nick felt like they were strangers, and it made him sad to see how disconnected his parents seemed to be from each other. The truth was, his parents were loaded, and when he was younger and had desperately wanted his father to be there for him, he never had been. It wasn't like Nick felt unloved as much as ignored. If Nick stayed out of trouble and got decent grades, he more or less had the freedom to come and go as he pleased, as long as he was home by curfew. What Mike and Rand didn't know was that Nick always had a bodyguard nearby who tried to remain inconspicuous. Because, when Nick had been 8 years old, he'd been kidnapped. Chapter 1. 2 years later. Nick would soon be ready to enter his sophomore year of high school, while Mike was going to be a senior. Mike had been trying to decide what to do with his life once he graduated from high school. No way could he afford college. His grades were good, but not quite good enough for a scholarship since he'd worked part-time to help his mom with expenses after turning 16. His mom didn't really agree with that and had refused to let Mike quit baseball since it meant so much to him. Plus, the friendships he'd made were valuable, she claimed, and it was important for him to enjoy his youth before going out into the real world and earning his living. Rand's grandfather was an Air Force colonel who'd attended several of their ball games when he'd been home. The colonel mostly worked stateside now, so even though he did a lot of traveling, he'd made an effort to stay close to Richmond since Rand's father had agreed not to enforce Rand's required long summer visitations to Wisconsin. After one of their last baseball games of the fall season, the colonel spoke with Mike about a career in the Air Force, even offering to put in a good word for him if he successfully made it through basic training and decided where his own specific talents were best suited. Even though Mrs. Morales wasn't thrilled about Mike enlisting, Mike was probably going to do it anyway. He finally admitted to Nick. His only other option was a dead-end job, and even his mom had acknowledged there was probably a better chance of Mike having a successful career someday if he was able to get an education by joining the service. On the day of their last scheduled ball game of the season, much to Nick's surprise, Dad motioned him into his study before he could make his way outside through the doorway to meet Rand. Their team would probably make the playoffs, though, which would involve another month of games after school or on Saturdays. Sit down, Nick, Dad murmured, closing the door behind Nick as he walked into the study. How's everything going, Dad? Nick asked, taking a seat in the chair facing Dad's desk. Same old, Dad answered. Nick noticed Dad was looking tired today, but that was probably because he'd been spent all night on a plane flying home from the UK. Is something wrong? I'll have to take off in about 10 more minutes because we have our last regular season game this afternoon, so we're all meeting early for a little extra practice. Dad was definitely looking at him with approval as he sat in the chair behind his desk. I thought I'd stop by today and watch you play. All I do is work, and I feel like I'm missing the best part of your life. Rand's grandfather mentioned to me the other day that you guys are really good. Dad grimaced. Actually, I think he was lecturing me. He made a point of coming to my office to speak with me. Nick's jaw dropped momentarily before he spoke. The colonel's one of the Hornets' biggest fans. Dad did something Nick hadn't seen him do in a while. He laughed. I'm going to make more of a point to go see the girls at their dance recitals and school plays this year, I've decided, because I'm going to delegate some of my workload. But since you're probably going to be going away to school in a few years, it's more important that I get to know you a little better, son. 5 minutes later, when Nick was walking outside through the doorway from the kitchen into the garage, he was feeling dazed. He couldn't recall a time that Dad had ever spoken to him as frankly as he just had now, like an equal. Nick was surprised to see Dad show up at the beginning of the game because in the back of his mind he still wasn't quite sure if Dad meant what he said. Nick hit 3 home runs during the course of the game, and both Mike and Rand were smiling from ear to ear when they won the game against one of the best teams in the league. "Geez, what's got into you today?" Mike asked, slapping Nick's back as they walked from the field. "I think I might have been showing off to my dad since he hasn't come to one of my games since I was like 8 years old." Glancing at Rand first before turning back to Nick, Mike looked puzzled. "Why?" "I've always wondered that myself," Rand murmured. "Even though I know what it's like, my grandfather's always been there for me." "It's not something I'm supposed to talk about," Nick said, watching his dad walking towards them. "I promise I'll tell you why when the time is right." Mike was studying Nick's dad. "I suppose it's something to do with that big guy who's always following you around." "It is," Nick answered softly. "Great game, guys," Dad said, reaching out and slapping Nick on his back. "I knew you were good, Nick, but not this good." "That has a lot to do with Mike here, who came into the picture a couple years ago. Mike Morales, this is my dad." Dad's look was definitely quizzical as he studied Mike before reaching out with his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mike. Are you sure we haven't met somewhere before?" Mike shook Dad's hand firmly. "No, not as far as I know, sir." "Mike," Mrs. Morales called out from the other side of the parking lot as she began to approach. "What a game! You guys were fantastic!" Dad turned, checking out Mrs. Morales, who had her eyes on Mike. Dad made a choking noise in his throat as Mike's mom came closer. Mrs. Morales must have just noticed Dad because she stilled, staring at his face. Dad appeared to be in shock until finally he spoke. "Therese, is that really you?" "Michael," she said with a certain formality in her voice. "You're still living in the area?" Nick's dad asked hoarsely. "We moved away for a while, but I had friends here, so I eventually came back." Looking puzzled, Dad asked, "We?" "My son and I," Mrs. Morales answered. Dad looked taken aback. "Your son?" "Don't try and pretend that you didn't know," Mike's mom growled. "Your fiancé had no problem doing your dirty work for you after I called and left the message." Dad truly looked confused. "Therese, I don't have a clue what you're talking about." Just then Mrs. Morales must have remembered they had an audience and looked shaken. She glanced at Mike, who seemed equally distressed. But Nick understood. "Dad, you and Mrs. Morales were dating before you married Mom?" Before Dad could answer, Mrs. Morales closed her eyes, saying softly, "You're on the right track, Nick. You and Mike hit it off right away, and it seemed to me that you were good for each other. I suppose I could have tried to break it up, but Mike has always had the freedom to choose his own friends." Nick murmured. Rand noticed the resemblance after we first met. "Mom?" Mike asked, looking uncertainly at his mom first and then at Nick's dad. "You said my father knew you were pregnant but didn't want the responsibility, so I've never had the desire to even know who he was. Are you telling me—" Dad looked stunned. Mrs. Morales heaved a sigh. "Yes, Mike. Mr. Hanover is your father."